Hello and welcome back to Parallax Scrolling for Web Design. In our last video, we finished up the styling for our page in our CSS file, and we fixed the background in place so that when we scroll, we see that our content scrolls, but our background stays put. Well, in this video, we're going to use jQuery to make the background scroll too, but it's going to scroll at a different rate than the content. So all of the files that we ended with in the last video are found in the Lesson 3 End folder, and those are the files we're starting with now. And then I've taken these files and copied them into the Lesson 4 End folder, and everything, all the changes that we make in this video are going to be stored there in the Lesson 4 End folder. So I'm going to jump into TextMate, and in the JavaScript folder so far, we just have jQuery. I'm going to create a new JavaScript file now, and I'm going to call this file parallax.js. So we'll create that file, and the first thing I want to do is to create a function that will control the speed of the scrolling of our background. Now, if you've never used jQuery before, I know I've said this before, but if you've never used jQuery before, then it might be a little difficult to understand what we're doing here because we're using jQuery, not just JavaScript. So if you've never used jQuery, I really want to encourage you to find an introductory jQuery training series before you jump into this. Otherwise, you can copy the code that I'm typing in here and get it to work just fine, but you might not completely understand everything that's going on. But again, I want to start by creating a function, and I'm going to call this function parallax, and this function is going to control how fast that background moves, and obviously it's also going to make it move. So what we want to do in this function is we want to check to see how far. We're going to look at the browser window and see what the current scroll position is. And there's actually an item that we can check called scroll top in JavaScript to tell where we are. And that item returns a number which represents how many pixels we've scrolled down. So we're going to create a variable here called scroll position, and we're going to set that equal to that scroll top value. And the way we get to that is using jQuery syntax here. We're going to point to the window, the browser window, dot scroll top with a capital T, open and close parentheses, semicolon to end your statement. So we're going to store that value in a variable called scroll position. Then we're going to use that variable, that scroll position variable, to set the top position of our background element. Now remember, our background is contained in a div with an ID of grid. So we're going to point to that div. Again, using jQuery syntax, we're going to point to pound grid, and then we're going to alter the CSS for that grid. So .css, and then inside parentheses, the CSS property that we're going to be altering is the top property. So we'll put that inside single quotes, comma, space, and then we type in the value that we want to change it to. Well, if we've scrolled down, let's say that we want our, first of all, to keep things simple, let's say we want our background to move at the same rate as the rest of our content, and then we'll fix it later. But for now, we want it to move at the same rate as the content itself. So right now, our background position is fixed, which means that even if we scroll, it's going to stay in the same place in the browser window. It's not going to scroll up and down with everything else. So if we wanted this to work, if we wanted it to scroll at the same speed as everything else, then we would look at that scroll top position, and let's say that we've scrolled down 100 pixels. If that happens and we want it to scroll at the same rate as everything else, then we want the top position of that item to move up 100 pixels. So basically, we want the top position of the grid, again, if we want it to move at the same rate as everything else, then we want that top position of the grid basically to be the negative of the scroll top position that we got up here. So the way we would do that is, let's go ahead and put this inside parentheses here, is we would type 0 minus scroll position. Remember, scroll position is the variable we created up here, which is storing that scroll top value. So this would give us a negative version of that value, and it would move the background up in the negative direction. It would move it up the same amount as everything else that has been scrolled. So then after we do that, we can't just set it to a number. Remember, let me skip a couple lines here and show you what this would look like in our CSS. Normally we would set top equal to 0 pixels or 100 pixels or something like that. So we can't just put a number here. We have to include the px as well. So here we've set the number, we've calculated the number that we need, but then we also need to add to it. So we'll type plus, and then inside single quotes, a px. So we need that px directly after that number. Make sure that there's no space before the px. So then we close our parentheses there, semicolon to end that statement, and then we can delete this down here. So again, this is the line of code we would use if we wanted the background to move at the same rate as the rest of our content. Now, if we test this right now, it's not going to work. First of all, let's save the file and point to it in our index file. So we're going to create another script tag, set our source equal to js/parallax.js, and then we'll put our closing script tag after that. We'll save that, and it's still not going to work. If we go back to our browser and test our page, try to scroll, it's still not work. It's still fixed in place. Well, the reason for that is pretty obvious. We've created a function, but we haven't called that function. We haven't told that function to run, and we need to do that when the page loads. What we're going to do is we're going to listen for the scroll event. We're going to listen for when the user starts scrolling the window, and when the window is scrolling, we want it to trigger this parallax function to continually check over and over again what that scroll top position is and to change the CSS of that grid accordingly. So again, this is going to happen over and over constantly as the user is scrolling up and down. And so let's move that function down, that parallax function, and we're going to put the rest of our code inside a document ready function for jQuery. So we'll type $, and then in parentheses we'll point to the entire document, dot ready, and when that document is ready, we're going to run this function. So we'll skip a couple lines, put our closing curly bracket and parentheses there, and then inside that function is where we're going to put the code to listen for that scrolling event, and then in response to that scrolling event, run this parallax function over and over again. So the way we do that is, again, we type the $, and then inside parentheses, we'll type the item we're pointing to, which is the entire window, and we're going to bind the scroll event. So the way we do that is we type .bind, and then inside parentheses, we type scroll inside single quotes, comma, space, and then we'll run a function, and we're going to put E inside that function because we need that event variable there. And then go ahead and put the closing curly bracket, parentheses, and closing semicolon to end that statement. And then inside this function here, we're simply going to point to the parallax function. So we'll just point to that here. And there we go. So again, what this is doing is it's binding the scroll event to our window so that anytime we scroll, we're going to run this function over and over again continuously. So inside that function, we're simply pointing to the parallax function where we have calculated the scroll position and adjusted the top position of our grid accordingly. So we'll save that. And remember, right now the grid should be moving up and down at the same rate as our content. So we'll refresh our page. And now as we scroll, we see that that is happening. Our background is now moving at the same rate. So how do we slow that background scroll down so that it moves at a slower rate? Well, it's easy. We just change the math a little bit. We'll jump back into our file, and here is where we're calculating that. All we need to do to get this to work properly is to make this number a little bit smaller. So let's say that we wanted to scroll our background at 20% of the speed of the rest of our content. Well, the way we do that is I'm going to put scroll position here inside parentheses. And then inside those parentheses, I'm simply going to multiply scroll position. Let's put a space here, space, asterisk, space, and then 0.2. So we're multiplying that scroll position by 0.2 so that it's not scrolling as fast. It's scrolling at 0.2 the speed of the scroll position, or 20% of the speed of everything else. So let's test that. Command S to save, jump back into our browser and refresh the page. And there we go. Now we've created our first parallax scrolling effect. As we scroll up and down in the file, we see that our text is still scrolling at the same rate it was before, but the background is now scrolling at 20% of the speed of that content. And that gives it a really cool effect. So that basically wraps it up for our first project. And we were able to do that using only a few lines of code. We didn't have to do much at all to get that to work. Just a little bit of math over here, and then we triggered this parallax function using the scroll event and binding that to the window. So again, it doesn't take a whole lot of code to make this work. And before we move on with our next file, I just want to clean something up to clear up some confusion here. Remember when we started the Lesson 3 discussion, we opened up a folder called Lesson 3 Start, and we didn't actually start editing it until Lesson 4. And at the end of that, we saved it as Lesson 3 End, and now we're saving this as Lesson 4 End, even though we're in Lesson 5 now. So just to clear up some confusion, I'm going to go ahead and change the name of this. I'm going to close this out, and we'll jump into Finder, and under Project Files, we're going to change Lesson 4 End to Lesson 5 End, just to clear any confusion. Now Lesson 3 End is still going to be where it is, even though it was at the end of Lesson 4, because those are the same files we started with at the beginning of Lesson 3. But I just wanted to do that because I just realized that we're in Lesson 5 and we were saving the folder as Lesson 4. So hopefully this will clear up any confusion regarding that. But with that wrapped up, in the next video, we're going to get started on our next project, where we're actually going to have 3 separate items that are scrolling at different speeds. So it's going to be a little more complicated. The HTML itself is going to be a little bit more complicated. And so we're actually going to start building the HTML together before we even get started on the CSS and the JavaScript. So again, we'll get started with that in the next video. Thank you for watching.